Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy World History. Before we begin today's journey, I want you to picture a young man, barely 20 years old, standing at the edge of a kingdom the ancient world barely noticed. Macedonia, small, rugged, and often dismissed by the Greek city-states, was far from the center of power. Yet from this unassuming land rose a figure whose name would thunder across continents and echo through history for over 2,000 years: Alexander the Great. He is more than a historical icon. He is a symbol of ambition that refused to be contained, of strategic brilliance that reshaped military thinking forever, and of the fiery, unstoppable spirit of youth. His story shows us what happens when someone believes not just in greatness, but in destiny. When we talk about Alexander, we are not simply listing battles or tracing conquests on a map. We are following the transformation of a boy who believed he was meant for more and who proved it through courage, intellect, and relentless determination. From the rocky hills of Macedonia, he marched through Asia Minor, shattered. The mighty Persian Empire was hailed as Pharaoh in Egypt and pressed onward into the unfamiliar lands of India. In just over a decade, he expanded a small kingdom into the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. His campaign wasn't just about domination. It was about uniting cultures, blending ideas, and shaping a new world that carried the imprint of Greece far beyond its borders. And today, you and I are going to relive that journey step by step. We'll walk beside Alexander through triumphs, betrayals, impossible battles, and moments where ambition drove him further than any conqueror before him. But before we dive deeper into this epic tale, if you enjoy historical storytelling, long-form documentaries, and deep explorations like this one, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps this channel grow and allows us to continue creating more massive historical adventures for you. Now get ready, because this is not simply a story about war or power. This is not just a chronicle of victories and defeats. This is the journey of a man who dared to reshape the world, a man whose legacy influenced empires, philosophies, and cultures long after his empire itself faded away. So, sit back, relax, and join me as we step into the life, the mind, and the extraordinary campaigns of one of history's most legendary figures, Alexander the Great. Let the adventure begin. To understand Alexander the Great, we must first understand the world and the bloodline into which he was born. Legends are rarely born in ordinary families, and Alexander was no exception. His lineage was the intersection of ambition and destiny, forged by two remarkable figures whose influence shaped the young prince long before he ever stepped onto a battlefield. His father, King Philip II, was the architect of Macedon's rise, a master strategist and a visionary reformer who transformed a vulnerable kingdom into the greatest military power in Greece. His mother, Olympias, was a Molossian princess with fierce loyalty, spiritual conviction, and a sense of destiny that bordered on divine certainty. Together, they formed the foundation upon which Alexander's greatness would be built. Alexander's family belonged to the Argead dynasty, a royal house that claimed descent from Heracles, the legendary son of Zeus. Whether this was truth, myth, or political propaganda hardly mattered. What mattered was that young Alexander grew up believing His bloodline connected him directly to the gods. The Argeads had ruled Macedonia for centuries, but the kingdom they inherited was far from glorious. Before Philip II's reign, Macedon was a rugged, often fragmented land caught between more powerful neighbors, the resilient Illyrians to the west, the Thracians to the east, and the highly sophisticated Greek city-states to the south. Macedon had kings, but not stability, bravery, but not discipline, potential, but not unity. All of that would change under Philip. Philip was not born into comfort. He spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, but rather than growing resentful, he absorbed the military innovations of the time. Living among Greeks who excelled in tactics and organization, Philip studied their strategies meticulously. When he eventually returned to Macedon, he carried with him not only knowledge, but motivation. He had seen what a great army could look like, and he knew Macedon could become unstoppable if shaped with the right hands. Upon taking the throne in 359 BCE, Philip inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Enemies pressed from every border, nobles competed for influence, and the army was poorly trained and poorly equipped. Yet Philip possessed a combination of strategic genius and relentless drive. He immediately set forth on a mission to rebuild Macedon from the ground up. One of his earliest reforms was transforming the Macedonian army. He introduced the phalanx with longer sarissa spears, drilling his men into disciplined formations that could overwhelm traditional hoplite lines. He professionalized the soldiers, implemented consistent training, and formed elite units like the companion cavalry, a force that Alexander would later use as a decisive hammer in nearly every campaign. In essence, Philip took a disorganized militia and forged it into a war machine. But Philip wasn't simply a military man. He was a political mastermind. He unified the Macedonian tribes, strengthened the economy, reformed taxation, and built alliances through diplomacy and, when necessary, through strategic marriages. It was through one of those marriages that Olympias came into the picture, but unlike his other political unions, this one would have a profound impact on history. Olympias, born Myrtale, was a princess of Epirus, a land deeply rooted in ancient rituals and mystical traditions. She belonged to the powerful Aeacidae lineage, which claimed descent from Achilles. This meant that Alexander could trace divine heritage from both sides, Heracles through Philip and Achilles through Olympias. For a boy raised in a world of gods, heroes, and myths, such lineage was not just a story, it was a call to destiny. Olympias was unlike the women of many Greek courts. She was intense, deeply spiritual, and fiercely ambitious for her son. Accounts describe her as passionate, unpredictable, and commanding, qualities that young Alexander would inherit in various forms. She was devoted to the cult of Dionysus and participated in rituals that seemed mysterious, even unsettling to outsiders. But within these traditions, she found strength, identity, and purpose. Olympias was convinced that Alexander was destined for greatness, and she nurtured him not just with affection, but with belief. The stories she told him, the myths she wove around his birth and lineage, helped shape the unshakable confidence that Alexander later displayed. To him, greatness wasn't just possible, it was expected. Though Philip and Olympias came from different worlds, they were similar in one crucial aspect. They were both consumed by ambition. And that ambition was poured into their son from the moment he was born. Philip saw a future commander, a warrior, a king who could achieve what he could not. Olympias saw a chosen one, a figure born to fulfill prophecies. Alexander grew up not with dreams imposed on him, but with destiny crafted around him. Despite his parents' influence, their relationship was far from peaceful. Philip was a man of many wives and many political alliances, while Olympias was protective and fiercely devoted to securing her son's place in the royal succession. Their marriage deteriorated over time, filled with suspicion, jealousy, and political tension. These conflicts profoundly shaped Alexander's perspective. He learned early on that the world of power was not built on harmony, but on constant struggle. He also learned to rely on his own judgment, his own ambition, and his own vision traits that would later guide him far beyond the boundaries of Macedon. But even as Philip and Olympias clashed, both remained central to Alexander's formation. From Philip, he absorbed the art of war, the importance of discipline, and the ambitions of a ruler who dreamed of conquering Persia. Philip had set the stage for a campaign that would have changed Greece forever, but fate intervened before he could lead it himself. From Olympias, Alexander gained his spiritual identity, his belief in destiny, and his understanding of leadership driven by charisma and emotional connection. Olympias also fostered within him a deep love of Greek culture, mythology, and heroic ideals. These beliefs became the backbone of Alexander's mindset as he marched through foreign lands, always seeing himself as a new Achilles seeking eternal glory. It is no exaggeration to say that Alexander was the product of both worlds, the disciplined, strategic world of Philip and the mystical, passionate world of Olympias. One parent shaped his intellect and military genius. The other shaped his heart and sense of destiny. Alexander did not simply inherit a throne, he inherited two legacies that pushed him toward greatness from opposite but equally powerful directions. As we move forward into Alexander's story, understanding this complex foundation is essential. His victories were not born in the deserts of Persia or the mountains of Afghanistan. They were born here in the competing influences of a brilliant king and a fierce queen. The boy who would conquer empires grew up under two different suns, the hard strategic light of Philip and the burning spiritual fire of Olympias. Together, they forged a ruler who believed not only that he could change the world, but that he was destined to. To understand the mind of Alexander the Great, the way he calculated risks, interpreted the world, and envisioned an empire unlike anything that had ever existed, we must look closely at the environment in which he was raised. Alexander's youth was not that of an ordinary prince. From the moment he could walk, he was surrounded by soldiers, philosophers, poets, and kings. His childhood was shaped by privilege, yes, but also by expectation. An expectation that he would someday rise above all who came before him. And central to that evolution, guiding him intellectually and shaping the foundation of his worldview, was one of the greatest minds in human history, Aristotle. Alexander's early years were spent in the royal court of Pella, a place buzzing with political intrigue, military strategists, foreign diplomats, and court advisors. Although Macedon was still considered barbaric by the southern Greeks, the royal palace was far from primitive. Philip II, constantly expanding his vision for Macedon, understood the value of culture and education. He ensured that Alexander and the other noble boys grew up in a vibrant intellectual atmosphere. This world exposed Alexander to the art of leadership from a young age. He observed generals discussing strategy, watched his father make decisions that shaped the kingdom, and absorbed the energy of a court filled with ambition. Education for Macedonian princes was not simply academic. It was immersive, experiential, and deeply connected to the evolving identity of the kingdom. Alexander learned to ride horses almost as soon as he learned to walk. By age 7, he was training with weapons, learning archery, spear handling, and the physical conditioning expected of future commanders. Yet his education extended far beyond combat. Philip II wanted his son to be a leader who could not only fight, but also think, negotiate, and inspire. So Alexander was also exposed to poetry, music, storytelling, and the legends of Greek heroes, Achilles, Heracles, Jason, Odysseus. These stories became more than entertainment. They became internal guides. Alexander admired Achilles above all, and throughout his life he would identify with the hero's quest for eternal glory. But Philip knew that even the stories of old were not enough. If he wanted his son to become more than a warrior, if he wanted him to become a philosopher king, he needed someone capable of shaping Alexander's mind with precision. And so he sent for Aristotle, the greatest living philosopher of the time, a protege of Plato, and a man whose intellect surpassed nearly all others. Aristotle accepted the task, but only on condition that he be given freedom to educate the prince in his own way. Philip agreed, and even restored Aristotle's hometown of Stagira as an offering of gratitude. Thus began one of the most remarkable teacher-student relationships in history. When Alexander was around 13 years old, he and a select group of noble boys were taken to Mieza, a secluded sanctuary surrounded by greenery, where Aristotle would tutor them away from the noise and politics of the court. This environment, calm, isolated, and intellectually rich, was perfect for shaping young minds. Aristotle believed education was not just about passing on information, but about teaching students how to think. He exposed Alexander to a wide range of disciplines: philosophy, science, medicine, astronomy, ethics, politics, zoology, botany, and more. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander learned to approach the world through observation, inquiry, and logic. Where most princes might learn only how to rule, Alexander learned how to understand the world itself. Aristotle introduced him to the works of Homer, especially the Iliad, which became Alexander's constant companion. He reportedly slept with a copy of it under his pillow, believing it to be the ultimate manual of heroism and leadership. Aristotle didn't just teach him to read it, he taught him to analyze it, interpret it, and internalize its lessons. Achilles for Alexander was no longer just a mythic figure. He became an ideal to emulate a model of excellence, courage, and eternal glory. Aristotle reinforced this by explaining that virtue, honor, and reason were the pillars of greatness. Alexander absorbed these lessons fully. Beyond literature and ethics, Aristotle taught Alexander science and medicine, subjects unusual for a future king, but they would prove invaluable later. Aristotle believed a commander must understand the natural world, the human body, and the effects of climate and geography. Alexander carried medical knowledge with him on campaign, often diagnosing or treating his own soldiers. This not only made him unique among generals, but also deepened the loyalty his men felt toward him. Aristotle also educated Alexander in political philosophy, teaching him the principles of governance, law, and diplomacy. He taught him that ruling requires not just strength, but clarity of mind and moral responsibility. Yet Aristotle, shaped by Greek ideals, believed in clear distinctions between Greeks and barbarians. He taught Alexander that Greeks were naturally suited to rule and others to be ruled. This idea influenced Alexander early on, but would later be challenged by his own experiences as he marched eastward, encountering cultures sophisticated and powerful in their own right. Perhaps most importantly, Aristotle introduced Alexander to the idea that the world was far larger and more complex than the Greeks had ever imagined. He planted in him a relentless curiosity, a desire not just to conquer lands, but to understand them. This curiosity would later drive Alexander to explore beyond the limits known to Greek civilization, venturing into regions that were almost mythical to his contemporaries. From Aristotle, Alexander inherited a worldview that blended logic with ambition, science with conquest, ethics with power. Aristotle did not simply produce a student, he helped shape a visionary. Under his mentorship, Alexander began to see beyond Macedonia, beyond Greece, and even beyond Persia. He began imagining a world where knowledge and empire could coexist, a world shaped by Greek culture, but enriched by the diversity of the lands he would someday conquer. It was during these formative years that Alexander developed the idea that conquest should not be an act of destruction, but one of unification. While he would later be shaped by experience hardship and the realities of war, the seeds of his vision were planted by Aristotle that a great leader should not merely dominate, but bring order to the world. Chinfuk de Thungyet conquer to unify was not just a military strategy, it was a philosophical one. It reflected the belief that the world could be harmonized under a single ruler, guided by knowledge, reason, and mutual respect. This philosophy distinguished Alexander from many conquerors before him. Where other kings sought tribute slaves or territory, Alexander sought something grander, the integration of cultures. His exposure to Greek thought taught him the value of learning from those he encountered. His later attempts to merge Macedonian and Persian cultures, encourage intermarriage, adopt foreign customs, and promote local administration were rooted in this intellectual foundation. Yet Alexander was not simply a passive student. He challenged Aristotle, questioned doctrines, debated ideas, and formed independent opinions. There are stories of their intellectual clashes, particularly about the treatment of non-Greeks. Alexander would eventually reject Aristotle's belief in Greek superiority, choosing instead to embrace a more universal approach to humanity. But the foundation Aristotle built allowed him to think critically, make informed decisions, and pursue a vision far beyond traditional Greek politics. By the time Alexander completed his studies, he was not merely educated, he was transformed. He carried with him an insatiable curiosity, a disciplined mind, and a philosophical framework that would guide him through his future campaigns. His worldview, shaped by Aristotle, was both practical and idealistic. He learned strategy from Philip, but he learned purpose from Aristotle. And when he eventually set out to conquer the world, he did so with the mind of a scholar, the heart of a hero, and the ambition of a king. To understand Alexander's extraordinary rise, we must look into his youth, those early moments when the world first caught a glimpse of the greatness that would later sweep across continents. Great leaders often reveal themselves long before they command armies. Their character shows itself in small acts of courage, sharp insight, and an uncanny sense of destiny. For Alexander, two powerful stories from his youth stand out above the rest, the legendary taming of Bucephalus and his early demonstrations of leadership in small but telling military engagements. Both events illuminated the temperament of a boy who was already more than a prince. He was in many ways a king waiting for his world to arrive. The story of Bucephalus has become one of the most repeated tales in ancient literature, a symbol of Alexander's fearless nature and extraordinary intuition. It begins when he was about 12 years old, during a day that was meant to be nothing more than a test of fine horses. King Philip II had summoned horse traders who presented a massive black stallion, wild-eyed and violently spirited. The horse was impressive, tall, strong, and clearly of exceptional breeding, but utterly uncontrollable. No matter how skilled the handlers were, Bucephalus bucked fiercely, threw riders off instantly, and resisted every attempt to calm him. The court watched with amusement, first then irritation, and finally frustration, as the traders insisted on a high price for what seemed to be an unusable animal. Philip was ready to dismiss the horse and send the traders away, but young Alexander stepped forward. He had been watching closely, not the way a child watches a spectacle, but the way a future commander observes a battlefield studying behavior patterns, motives. While the men mocked the horse and blamed its temperament, Alexander noticed something subtle yet crucial. The animal wasn't wild because it was vicious. It was terrified. Bucephalus was panicking because of the shadows that danced across the ground each time he turned. He reared not out of rage, but out of fear. Alexander approached Philip and said boldly that the horse could indeed be tamed and that the men handling it simply didn't know what they were doing. The court erupted in laughter. A mere boy claiming to do what trained horsemen could not. It was unthinkable. Philip, half amused and half irritated, challenged Alexander. If he believed he could tame the stallion, he could try. But if he failed, he would have to pay the full price of the horse himself, a sum far beyond a prince's allowance. Alexander accepted without hesitation. The moment that followed would become a hallmark of his legend. He walked toward Bucephalus calmly, slowly speaking gently to him. He turned the horse toward the sun so its shadow no longer frightened it. Then, with astonishing boldness, he stroked the stallion's mane, mounted its back in a single fluid motion, and held firm as the horse surged forward. The court fell silent, jaws dropping as Alexander guided the stallion with steady hands and unwavering confidence. What moments earlier had been a creature of chaos was suddenly a reflection of harmony under the prince's command. When Alexander returned, sitting tall upon the subdued Bucephalus, Philip was moved to tears. He embraced his son and said, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is far too small for you." This moment was more than a charming childhood anecdote. It was the first clear sign of Alexander's unique blend of courage, intelligence, sensitivity, and absolute fearlessness. He did not dominate the horse by force. He mastered it by understanding it. It was a lesson in leadership he would carry for the rest of his life. Bucephalus became his lifelong companion, riding with him into countless battles across Asia. Their bond reflected the core of Alexander's leadership: mutual trust, fierce loyalty, and an unbreakable spirit. But Alexander's early promise did not end with Bucephalus. Even before he became king, he was already stepping into leadership roles that tested and sharpened his instincts. As he grew into adolescence, Philip began taking him on military inspections, diplomatic missions, and strategic councils. Alexander didn't simply observe, he absorbed. He learned how commanders spoke to their men, how they evaluated terrain, how they negotiated with local leaders. Philip understood that experience was the greatest teacher. So he gradually entrusted Alexander with responsibilities reserved for grown men. One of the earliest demonstrations of Alexander's leadership occurred when he was barely 16. Philip had to leave Macedon to confront a threat in the north. In his absence, he appointed Alexander as regent, effectively placing the young prince in charge of the kingdom. It was an extraordinary responsibility for someone so young, but Philip clearly believed his son was ready. Alexander quickly proved him right. When a Thracian tribe rebelled thinking Philip's absence offered an opportunity to attack, Alexander responded with decisive action. Instead of waiting for reinforcements or seeking counsel from older generals, he led the cavalry himself and crushed the rebellion with speed and precision. He didn't just defeat them, he established a city on the conquered territory and named it Alexandropolis, a precursor to the many cities that would later bear his name across Asia. This display of initiative was a remarkable sign of maturity, vision, and strategic thinking. But Alexander's most famous military moment as a teenager came during the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE when he was only 18. Philip's growing Macedonian army faced an alliance of Greek city-states, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and others determined to resist Macedonian dominance. This was not a training exercise. It was one of the most significant battles in Greek history. Philip placed Alexander on the left wing, commanding the elite companion cavalry. It was a position of immense responsibility. The turning point of the battle came when the Theban Sacred Band, a legendary unit of highly trained soldiers, threatened to break Philip's line. Alexander, seizing the moment, led his cavalry in a bold charge directly into their flank. The attack was perfectly timed and executed with blistering speed. The Sacred Band, undefeated for generations, collapsed under the ferocity of the assault. Ancient historians claim that Alexander was first to break the enemy line, fighting at the front like Achilles, his boyhood hero. This victory wasn't just a tactical success, it was a moment that confirmed Alexander as a warrior prince of extraordinary capability. Soldiers who fought beside him saw not only youth, but a leader who shared their risks, felt no fear, and possessed instincts beyond his years. After Chaeronea, the army no longer viewed him as the king's son. They saw him as a commander in his own right. All these stories, Bucephalus, the Thracian campaign, Chaeronea, formed the early portrait of a young man destined to shape history. They reveal a mind that recognized opportunity. Where others saw chaos, a spirit that embraced challenge rather than fled from it, and a character forged not in comfort, but in responsibility. Alexander's youth was not a time of idle luxury. It was a crucible in which his courage, intellect, and natural leadership were tested and proven. By the time he reached adulthood, Alexander was more than prepared to rule. He was poised, sharpened, and hungry for greatness. Every early triumph, every risk he boldly took, every decision he made with the confidence of someone far beyond his years became stepping stones toward the empire he would soon carve from the world. In these youthful marks, the taming of a wild stallion and the command of soldiers twice his age, we see not just the boy he was, but the king he was becoming. Fearless, insightful, and unstoppable. The transition from prince to king is rarely smooth, but for Alexander, it began with shock blood and uncertainty. At just 20 years old, he was thrust into a moment that could have ended his destiny before it ever truly began. The assassination of King Philip II was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake that threatened to shatter the fragile stability of Macedonia. The kingdom Philip had built through decades of war diplomacy and reform stood at the edge of chaos. In the eyes of the world, Alexander was young, too young perhaps, to hold together an empire his father had carved with such relentless will. But within days, Alexander would prove that he was not only capable of wearing the crown, but that he was ready to defend it with the same unstoppable force that would later define his entire reign. The assassination took place during the wedding celebrations of Philip's daughter Cleopatra in 336 BCE. Amid the crowds and festivities, Philip walked proudly toward the theater, surrounded by nobles, soldiers, and foreign dignitaries. Suddenly, Pausanias, a member of Philip's own elite guard, rushed forward and struck the king down with a dagger. In an instant, the architect of Macedon's rise lay dead before the eyes of thousands. Panic surged. Some believed it was a personal vendetta. Others suspected political conspiracy. Speculations spread like wildfire, and in the chaos, Macedon faced a more pressing danger, the vacuum of power. Philip had prepared Alexander for leadership, but even so, a 20-year-old ascending the throne of a war-hardened kingdom was a risk many were unwilling to accept. Within hours of Philip's death, factions within the court began maneuvering. Some nobles considered placing Philip's newborn son, Alexander's half-brother, on the throne, using his youth as a way to control power from behind the scenes. Foreign diplomats whispered among themselves, wondering whether this was the moment to encourage revolts in the territories Macedonia had forced into submission. But Alexander did not wait. He acted swiftly, decisively, and ruthlessly when required. He understood exactly what was at stake. Hesitation could cost him the throne his father had shaped for him. Drawing on the confidence he had earned through years of serving beside Philip in campaigns and councils, Alexander stepped forward to claim the kingship. The Macedonian army, loyal to Philip's bloodline and deeply impressed by Alexander's performance at Chaeronea, quickly rallied behind him. Their support was crucial. It allowed Alexander to silence internal dissent before it could take shape. Within days, he eliminated potential rivals. Those who threatened the stability of the throne were removed or exiled. His actions were swift, and though harsh, they were necessary. Macedon could not afford fracture, yet securing the throne at home was only the first step. The real challenge lay beyond Macedonia's borders. Philip's dominance over the Greek city-states, Athens, Thebes, Sparta, Corinth, had been built through years of conflict and careful political maneuvering. These states had reluctantly accepted Macedonian hegemony under the pressure of Philip's military successes. But now, with Philip gone, they saw an opportunity. A young king, inexperienced and untested, would surely lack the authority to maintain control. The Greek world stirred with excitement and suspicion, waiting to see whether Alexander would falter. Rebellions began to ignite. In Athens, leaders debated whether to break free from Macedonian rule. Demosthenes, the famed orator and longtime critic of Macedon, reportedly celebrated Philip's death, declaring that the tyrant had fallen. Thebes watched closely, gauging the mood of the region. Further north, the Thracian tribes and Illyrian chieftains began mobilizing. The moment Philip died, a chain reaction of revolt threatened to unravel everything he had built. But the young king did not collapse under pressure. Instead, he reacted with speed that stunned the ancient world. Alexander understood the power of momentum, both in battle and in politics. His strategy was simple yet brilliant: move so quickly and forcefully that rebellion would die before it could fully ignite. Macedon could not afford a prolonged conflict with the Greek city-states while its northern borders were threatened. So, Alexander acted with the same audacity that had allowed him to tame Bucephalus' lead cavalry at Chaeronea and earn the respect of hardened soldiers. First, he marched north. The Thracians, expecting hesitation or diplomatic overtures from the young king, were caught completely off guard. Alexander led his army through dangerous mountain passes, forcing his enemies into positions where their numbers and terrain advantage were useless. His rapid advance crushed the rebellions in Thrace before they could spread. Then, hearing that Illyrian leaders had joined forces in a grand revolt, Alexander pushed forward again. He moved with astonishing intensity, covering distances that generals twice his age would have found impossible. The Illyrians, shocked by the speed of Macedon's response, broke apart. Their unity dissolved. Their armies retreated. Their leaders fled. Each victory added weight to Alexander's authority. Each rapid strike reinforced the message: Philip may be gone, but Macedon's power had not weakened. If anything, it had grown even more dangerous under its new king. But the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity lay in Greece. Word soon reached the Greek city-states that Alexander was occupied in the north. Sensing a chance to reclaim their independence, Thebes made the boldest move. Rumors spread in Thebes that Alexander had been killed in the northern campaign. Whether the rumor was deliberate deception or hopeful speculation, it triggered an uprising. The city expelled the Macedonian garrison and declared liberation from Macedonian rule. Athens began preparing its own revolt. If the rumor had been true, a wave of rebellions would have swept across Greece. But Alexander was not only alive, he was furious. What followed became one of the most iconic displays of speed and military discipline in ancient history. Upon hearing the news, Alexander ordered his army south immediately. They marched nearly 300 miles in less than 2 weeks, an achievement so unbelievable that historians still marvel at it. By the time the Greek city-states realized the rumor was false, Alexander was already approaching their borders. Panic swept through Athens. Thebes, however, refused to back down. Alexander was now faced with a pivotal decision, one that would shape how Greece viewed him for the rest of his reign. If he showed weakness, rebellions would rise everywhere. If he acted ruthlessly, he would cement Macedon's dominance, but at the cost of Greek goodwill. He chose decisiveness. When Alexander reached Thebes, he offered the city a chance to surrender, hoping to avoid bloodshed. They refused. Thebes believed that Macedon could not maintain long-term power, that Alexander was too young to command stability, that they could win back their independence if only they resisted long enough. They were wrong. The assault on Thebes was swift and overwhelming. Alexander's forces stormed the city with precision. The Theban sacred band, once legendary, now faced the king who had shattered them years earlier. Alexander fought with determination, leading from the front, as he always did. By the end of the battle, Thebes was destroyed. Its walls were torn down, its people sold into slavery, and its lands divided among Macedon's allies. It was a brutal act, but an act that sent a message that echoed throughout Greece. Macedon's authority was unshakable. Alexander was not Philip's shadow. He was Philip's successor, in every sense. Athens, witnessing Thebes' destruction, immediately backed down. Other Greek states quickly reaffirmed their loyalty. The rebellion that had threatened to shatter Macedon was crushed completely. In just over a year, the 20-year-old king had secured his throne, subdued the northern tribes, and silenced all Greek opposition. His speed, decisiveness, and sheer audacity had turned uncertainty into stability. The Greek world now viewed him with the same mixture of fear and awe they had once reserved for Philip. But Alexander did not see these victories merely as political necessities. For him, they were preparation. He believed his destiny lay far beyond Macedonia or Greece. Philip had built the foundation for a campaign into Persia, and Alexander viewed it not only as a continuation of his father's vision, but as the first step toward his own unparalleled legacy. The young king, who had been tested by assassination, rebellion, and war, now stood ready to do what no Greek had ever done: challenge the greatest empire on earth. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE, he was not merely transporting an army into Asia, he was carrying an entire civilization's ambition with him. For centuries, the Greeks had looked across the Aegean toward Persia with a mixture of fear, resentment, and fascination. The Persian Empire was vast, wealthy, and powerful, a sprawling dominion stretching from Egypt to India. For the Greeks, it had long been both an enemy and a reminder of their own limitations. While Philip II had conceived the idea of invading Persia, Alexander transformed that ambition into action. As his ships touched the Asian shore, he did not just step onto foreign soil, he stepped into history. The crossing itself was rich with symbolism. Alexander chose to land near the ancient city of Troy, a gesture meant to tie his campaign to the legendary heroes he revered. He led sacrifices to Athena and paid homage to Achilles, his mythic role model. According to tradition, he placed a wreath on Achilles' tomb, declaring that he envied the hero not for his victories, but for having a friend like Patroclus. This act was more than ceremonial. It was a declaration. Alexander was setting out on a conquest that would echo the myths of the past, yet surpass them in scale and consequence. But Alexander knew that sentiment alone would not secure his ambitions. The first test of his campaign came almost immediately. The Persian satraps, provincial governors in Asia Minor, had gathered their forces near the Granicus River, determined to crush the young Macedonian king before he could establish a foothold. They knew that if Alexander gained momentum, Persia's western territories would be vulnerable. So, they prepared to strike with a combined force of cavalry and Greek mercenaries, battle-hardened soldiers hired by Persian gold. The Persians positioned themselves on the eastern bank of the Granicus, a steep embankment that gave them a defensive advantage. Their cavalry lined the river's edge, shields, glinting horses restless, awaiting orders. The Greek mercenaries stood behind them, ready to be the anvil against which the Persians hoped to hammer the Macedonian advance. The river itself was not wide, but its currents were strong, and the banks were uneven, a natural obstacle that favored the defenders. Alexander's generals urged caution. Attacking immediately, they insisted, would be dangerous. The river would disrupt the phalanx formation, the cavalry would struggle to charge, and the Persians would have the advantage of high ground and superior position. Many commanders suggested waiting until dawn to attempt a crossing under more controlled conditions. But Alexander was not a leader who sought safe paths. He understood the psychology of war as deeply as he understood its mechanics. If he hesitated now, at the very beginning of his invasion, Persian morale would rise. His own army, fresh on foreign soil, might begin to doubt the momentum of their campaign. Delay would give the Persians time to reinforce, reorganize, and potentially strike him on their terms. Alexander knew that the first blow in war was often the most important, so he made his decision quickly, decisively. They would attack immediately. The Macedonian army arranged itself with characteristic precision. At the center stood the phalanx, armed with the long sarissa spears that Philip had introduced. Their formation was a wall of bristling points, deadly when advancing on flat land, but still formidable even in difficult terrain. On the wings were the cavalry units that formed the backbone of Alexander's offensive power. The most elite among them were the companion cavalry personally led by Alexander himself. These were not merely horsemen. They were aristocratic warriors, bound by loyalty, hardened by training, and inspired by the knowledge that they served under a commander who fought in the front line. Alexander positioned himself on the right flank, the place of highest honor and greatest danger. It was here that battles were often decided, where a king could inspire victory or suffer death. His armor shone brightly in the fading light, and his presence radiated confidence. As he surveyed the opposing forces, he recognized that this moment would set the tone for the entire campaign. The battle began with an audacious move. Alexander ordered a portion of his cavalry to initiate a feint attack upriver, drawing the attention of Persian commanders. As the Persians shifted their cavalry in response, Alexander seized the opening and led his own unit directly into the river. His men followed, urging their horses through the strong currents, spears held high. Arrows and javelins rained down from the Persian bank, but the Macedonians pressed forward, shouting war cries as they ascended the slippery embankment. The moment Alexander emerged from the riverbank, he became the focal point of the Persian attack. The Persian cavalry charged him fiercely, surrounding him in a whirl of hooves, metal, and dust. But this was exactly where Alexander fought best, up close in the chaos, where skill and courage outweighed numbers. He wielded his Xiphus short sword with precision, striking down enemy commanders and rallying his men with every blow. The companion cavalry followed him with unwavering loyalty, creating a wedge formation that pierced the Persian lines. Their charge was devastating. These cavalrymen were trained to fight as a unit, their horses conditioned for aggressive maneuvers, their spears designed for impact. As they broke through the phalanx, advanced across the river behind them. Though the crossing was difficult, the disciplined Macedonian infantry maintained cohesion. Once their long sarissas were planted firmly, they became an unstoppable force, pushing forward with rhythm and determination. The Persians, expecting to repel disorganized attackers, were instead confronted with a relentless unified advance. Their lines began to falter. The Macedonian cavalry exploited every weakness, wheeling and striking with calculated aggression. Alexander himself targeted the Persian commanders, knowing that killing or incapacitating leaders would demoralize the rest of the army. During the clash, Alexander narrowly escaped death. A Persian nobleman, Rosaces, struck him with a downward blow that split his helmet and grazed his skull. Before the man could deliver a second strike, Clitus the Black, a loyal officer and longtime friend, intervened, severing the attacker's arm and saving Alexander's life. It was a reminder of the dangers the young king willingly embraced, fighting alongside his men rather than directing from afar. With their cavalry shattered and their commanders dead or scattered, the Persian forces began to collapse. The Greek mercenaries, positioned behind the main Persian lines, attempted to regroup into a defensive formation. But Alexander, unwilling to let them become a future threat, ordered his infantry to surround them. The resulting battle was brutal. Many mercenaries were killed. The survivors were sent to forced labor in Macedonia, a symbolic gesture that reinforced Alexander's message: Greek warriors who fought for Persia would not be tolerated. The victory at Granicus was total. Persian resistance in Asia Minor, once seen as formidable, crumbled in the face of Macedonian strength. But the battle was significant, not just for its tactical mastery or its casualties. It was symbolic. It showed the world and Persia that Alexander was not a boy playing king. He was a conqueror, a strategist, a leader whose ambition matched his father's and whose courage surpassed it. Granicus opened the gates to Asia. City after city began to fall to Alexander's advance, some through battle, others through surrender. The young king's legend began to grow. Tales of his bravery spread across the region. Fear rippled through Persian territories. Admiration blossomed among Greek cities. Alexander had proven that the mightiest empire in the world could bleed, and from that moment on, he intended to make it bleed again and again until it fell. The Battle of Granicus was the first spark of a campaign that would reshape the world. It marked the beginning of Alexander's ascent, not just as a king or a general, but as a force of history whose momentum would only grow stronger as he pressed deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was vast, so vast that it often seemed less like a kingdom and more like a world unto itself. For centuries, its rulers commanded the greatest armies, the richest cities, and a chain of satrapies stretching across continents. But all empires, no matter how formidable, rely on the strength and decisiveness of a single man at the top. And in 333 BCE, that man was Darius III. When he finally marched out to face Alexander, he did so with the belief that he was about to crush a reckless upstart who had dared to disturb the peace of Asia. What he didn't realize was that the encounter at Issus would mark the beginning of the end for his empire and the rise of a new legend. After the victory at Granicus, Alexander pushed south through Asia Minor with incredible momentum. City after city fell under his control. Satraps defected or surrendered. Greek communities welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. But Alexander knew that a greater storm was gathering. Darius III could no longer ignore the threat. The defeat at Granicus had alarmed the Persian court, but it was the speed of Alexander's advance that forced Darius into action. Realizing that local commanders were no match for the Macedonian king, he decided to assemble the full might of the empire. Tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry were summoned from afar. Medes, Babylonians, Persians, Armenians, Syrians, and contingents from countless other regions under Persian rule. This was not a mere army. It was the embodiment of imperial power. Darius hoped to intimidate Alexander before the battle even began. The sheer size of the Persian army dwarfed the Macedonian force. Ancient sources claim Darius commanded anywhere from 100,000 to over 500,000 men, numbers likely exaggerated, but nevertheless representative of a truly massive fighting force. Alexander, meanwhile, had roughly 40,000 soldiers, disciplined and experienced, but vastly outnumbered. In every conventional sense, This was a battle the young king was not supposed to win. But Alexander was no conventional commander. The two armies maneuvered for position in the region of Cilicia, a narrow coastal strip wedged between mountains and sea. Alexander, believing Darius was marching south, positioned his men accordingly. But Darius, taking advantage of the terrain, executed a bold maneuver. He swung north, passed behind Alexander through the mountain passes, and positioned his massive army at Issus, effectively cutting off the Macedonians from their supply lines. It was a move that caught Alexander off guard. For a brief moment, the Macedonian king was in a precarious situation. But Alexander never panicked. Instead, he turned his army around and marched back north, eager for the confrontation. To him, it didn't matter whether Darius had outmaneuvered him strategically. What mattered was that the great king was finally within reach. This was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. A victory here would shake the Persian Empire to its core. The battlefield at Issus was far from ideal for Darius. It was a narrow plain, trapped between the mountains and the Mediterranean Sea, leaving little room for the vast Persian army to deploy effectively. Darius, positioned at the rear, on a magnificent war chariot, expected his numerical superiority to overwhelm the Macedonians. But Alexander saw the terrain differently. The narrow space neutralized much of the Persian advantage. For the first time, Alexander would face Darius directly, and the battlefield conditions unexpectedly favored the smaller, more disciplined Macedonian force. As the armies prepared for battle, the Persian camp was a spectacle of wealth and power. Gold-plated armor, ornately decorated chariots and banners from every corner of the empire filled the field. In contrast, the Macedonian camp was simple, hardened, built for war. Alexander's men knew they were outnumbered, but they also knew something the Persians did not. Their commander thrived in impossible situations. When dawn broke, Alexander rode along his lines, addressing his soldiers with calm certainty. He reminded them of their victories, of their discipline, of their superiority in training and morale. He pointed to the narrow plain and emphasized how the Persians could not bring their full strength to bear. His confidence was infectious. By the time he returned to the right flank, the Macedonian army was ready. The battle began with fierce fighting on the Macedonian left, where the Persians attempted to break through and envelop Alexander's forces. But the Macedonian phalanx, with its bristling wall of sarissas, held firm. Their discipline, under pressure, was unmatched. While the phalanx locked the Persian infantry in place, Alexander prepared the decisive blow on the right. Here, the companion cavalry waited elite riders, clad in shining armor, mounted on powerful horses, loyal to Alexander to the death. The moment the phalanx stabilized the center, Alexander seized his opportunity. He led the cavalry himself, riding his beloved Bucephalus, and launched a thunderous charge directly toward the Persian line. But Alexander did not target any part of the line. He aimed for one man, Darius III. This was not recklessness. This was strategy. Alexander knew that Persian armies often depended heavily on the presence and authority of their kings. If Darius fell, or if Darius fled, the entire Persian line would collapse. It was not necessary to kill every soldier. It was necessary to break their spirit. And the quickest way to do that was to strike at the heart. As Alexander's cavalry sliced through the Persian right wing, a gap formed in the center. The Macedonian king, seizing the moment, turned his attack inward, driving toward Darius's chariot with ferocious determination. Arrows flew, spears shattered, horses screamed. The clash was brutal and chaotic. Alexander cut down Persian nobles and bodyguards as he advanced relentlessly. He was close, so close that Darius could surely see him coming. What happened next would define the battle. Darius, seeing Alexander break through the lines and closing in, was overcome with fear. For all his wealth, power, and troops, the great king had never faced an enemy like this. He had never seen a commander who fought on the front line, who led charges personally, who sought out the king himself. And so in a moment, that changed the course of history. Darius abandoned his chariot and fled, causing panic to ripple through the Persian ranks. When the king fled, the soldiers felt abandoned. Confidence dissolved into chaos. The massive Persian army began to crumble as Macedonian cavalry pursued them relentlessly. Alexander wanted to chase Darius to end the war in a single day, but the battlefield demanded his attention. His left flank was still engaged, and the Persians there were fighting desperately, unaware that their king had fled. Alexander turned back and reinforced his phalanx, overpowering the remaining Persian forces until the victory was complete. The aftermath was monumental. The Persian camp fell into Alexander's hands, including Darius's family, his mother, Sisigambis, his wife Statera, and his children. Alexander treated them with respect, a gesture that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the battlefield. He assured Sisigambis that she would be honored as a queen, saying, "You shall have your son in me." The world watched in awe. Alexander's victory at Issus was not just military, it was psychological. The once invincible Persian Empire now seemed vulnerable. Its king had fled before the face of a man barely in his 20s, and in doing so, Darius inadvertently created a new legend. Alexander was now the greatest threat the Persian Empire had ever faced. Issus became a turning point, the moment when Alexander's campaign shifted from a daring invasion to a legitimate conquest. For the first time, the world saw that he was capable of defeating not just regional commanders, but the great king himself. Persia trembled. Greece rejoiced. Alexander marched forward more determined than ever. And Darius, humiliated but still king, realized that the battle for his empire had only begun. After the stunning victory at Issus, Alexander found himself at a crossroads not of geography, but of strategy. Persia was shaken. Darius was in retreat, and Asia Minor had fallen under Macedonian control. Yet Alexander knew that defeating the Persian Empire required more than chasing a fleeing king. He needed to break the empire's infrastructure, cut off its naval capabilities, and secure a foundation from which he could advance deeper into the east. That meant seizing control of the eastern Mediterranean coast, a corridor of fortified cities, wealthy ports, and strategic gateways. Among them stood two of the most formidable obstacles of his entire campaign, Tyre and Gaza. And beyond them lay Egypt, a land whose ancient grandeur would embrace Alexander with open arms and crown him as a divine ruler. The first and most daunting challenge was Tyre, the island fortress of the Phoenicians. Tyre was not a typical city. Located half a mile offshore, it was surrounded by massive defensive walls rising over 150 feet above the sea. Its navy was strong, its people fiercely proud, and its location made it practically invulnerable to land armies. For centuries, Tyre had resisted foreign invaders, including the mighty Assyrians, who had spent years trying to break it. Now, when Alexander demanded entry to perform a symbolic sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom the Greeks associated with Heracles, the Tyrians refused. They did not fear Alexander. They believed no one could breach their sanctuary in the sea. Alexander did not respond with immediate rage. Instead, he responded with something far more terrifying resolve. If Tyre would not allow him onto its island, he would build a way to reach them. What followed was one of the greatest military engineering feats of the ancient world. Alexander ordered the construction of a massive causeway, a stone and timber bridge stretching from the mainland to the island. It was an audacious idea that no other commander had ever attempted on such a scale. Soldiers, engineers, laborers, and even local populations were conscripted to move enormous rocks into the shallow waters near the coast. Slowly, meter by meter, the causeway extended toward Tyre. The Tyrians watched with growing alarm. At first they laughed, confident the sea and storms would destroy Alexander's efforts. But as the causeway grew and siege towers began to rise along its length, the laughter turned to panic. They launched ships to harass the workers, unleashed fire attacks on the wooden structures, and even performed daring raids to destroy the emerging bridge. Each setback might have crippled an ordinary army, but Alexander refused to stop. He expanded the causeway, called in naval forces from conquered Phoenician cities, and brought siege engines capable of breaking down the island's walls. After months of deadly labor, sun-scorched days, and constant danger, the Macedonians were finally close enough to launch a full assault. The Tyrians fought with desperate courage, but the combination of Alexander's land forces and his newly assembled naval fleet proved overwhelming. After 7 brutal months, the defenses of Tyre collapsed. The Macedonians stormed the city in a wave of fury, fueled by exhaustion and vengeance. Tyre fell. Ancient sources describe the aftermath as tragic and merciless. Thousands were killed, and many more were enslaved. Alexander allowed his soldiers to express their rage, but he also spared those who sought sanctuary in the temples. The destruction of Tyre sent a message that echoed across the Mediterranean. No city, no matter how fortified or proud, could stand in the way of Alexander's vision. From Tyre, Alexander marched south toward Gaza, the key fortress commanding the gateway into Egypt. Unlike Tyre, Gaza was not an island, but it was built on high ground, heavily fortified, and determined to resist. Its ruler, a Persian loyalist named Badis, refused to surrender. He believed Gaza's strong walls and elevation would repel any assault. Alexander respected Gaza's strategic importance. He could not leave such a stronghold behind him as he pushed toward Egypt. The siege that followed was difficult and costly. The defenders launched arrows, stones, and boiling substances as Macedonian soldiers attempted to breach the walls. Alexander himself participated actively, directing siege engines and personally encouraging his troops. During one assault, he was struck by an arrow that penetrated his shoulder. Even wounded, he refused to withdraw, demonstrating the same ferocity that defined his leadership from youth. After months of resistance, the walls of Gaza were breached. The Macedonians poured through the gaps, overwhelming the defenders with disciplined force. The city fell, and Battus was captured. Alexander furious at Battus's refusal to submit, had him executed in a manner reminiscent of Achilles' treatment of Hector, another moment in which Alexander acted not just as a king, but as a man consciously living in the shadow of myth. With Gaza subdued, the doors to Egypt lay open. Unlike Tyre or Gaza, Egypt greeted Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians had long resented Persian rule, viewing the Persians as disrespectful and oppressive. When Alexander and his army entered Memphis in 332 BCE, they were welcomed with celebrations and honors. Priests and nobles bowed before him. The people offered gifts, sacrifices, and songs of gratitude. Alexander understood the importance of legitimacy. He treated local customs with respect and participated in religious ceremonies. His journey through Egypt reached its peak when he traveled to the Siwa oasis deep in the Libyan desert to consult the oracle of Amun. This was not an easy trek. Miles of barren sand, scorching heat, and treacherous dunes separated Siwa from the Nile Valley. Yet Alexander undertook the journey with a sense of purpose that astonished even his closest men. He believed the oracle could confirm something he had long suspected, that his destiny was divine. When he arrived, the priests of Amun greeted him with reverence. Accounts vary, but many sources suggest that the oracle declared Alexander to be the son of Amun, the supreme god of Egypt, equivalent to Zeus in Greek belief. Whether through solemn pronouncement, symbolic gesture, or ambiguous phrasing, interpreted by Alexander himself, the message was clear. He was not merely a king, he was a chosen one. This recognition transformed Alexander's rule in Egypt. In a grand ceremony, he was crowned Pharaoh, the legitimate ruler of Egypt. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt rested on his head, and his name was inscribed in pharaonic cartouches. He was embraced as a divine monarch in a civilization that had honored living gods for thousands of years. Alexander used this newfound legitimacy wisely. He commissioned the construction of a new city on the Mediterranean coast. Alexandria, destined to become one of the greatest cultural and intellectual centers of the ancient world. He restored temples, respected local traditions, and earned the trust of the Egyptian people. His time in Egypt was one of the rare periods in his campaign marked not by bloodshed, but by harmony, diplomacy, and visionary planning. Yet Alexander was not a man to linger. He had a larger mission, one that stretched far beyond Egypt. With the coast secured, Phoenician power broken, and Egypt under his control, he refocused his attention on the heart of Persia. Darius was still out there. The empire still stood, and Alexander, bolstered by divine recognition and unstoppable momentum, was ready to strike deeper into Asia. The fall of Tyre, the capture of Gaza, and the embrace of Egypt were not just sequential events. They were milestones in a transformation. Alexander was no longer merely the king of Macedon or the commander of a victorious army. He was becoming a world conqueror, one whose name would be carried across continents, etched into cities, whispered in courts, and feared in battlefields. 3 years after Issus, the world had changed. Persia trembled. Egypt bowed. The Mediterranean opened its gates, and Alexander now, both king and pharaoh, marched forward with the confidence of a man who believed his destiny was not just to rule nations, but to reshape the entire known world. By the autumn of 331 BCE, the world had reached a moment of extraordinary tension. For centuries, the Persian Empire had dominated the ancient world with unmatched wealth, military power, and sheer geographic scale. From the shores of the Aegean to the plains of India, its influence shaped nations, cultures, and kings. But now, for the first time since its founding, the empire stood on the precipice of destruction. And at the center of this storm were two men, Alexander of Macedon, blazing with momentum and divine ambition, and Darius III, determined to reclaim his dignity and save his collapsing empire. Their confrontation at Gaugamela, a small, otherwise insignificant plain near modern-day Iraq, would become one of the most decisive battles in history. Darius had learned from his defeat at Issues. He understood that the narrow terrain of that battlefield had prevented him from deploying his massive army effectively. So this time, he meticulously prepared a battleground specifically designed to showcase Persia's greatest advantage, sheer numbers. Gaugamela was chosen for its vast flat expanse and enormous plain, perfect for cavalry maneuvers and ideal for allowing the Persians to surround the smaller Macedonian force. But Darius did not leave anything to chance. He ordered the ground to be leveled and cleared, removing bumps, rocks, and obstacles to ensure his scythed chariots, fast, deadly vehicles with blades extending from their wheels, could charge unhindered into Macedonian lines. It was a man-made arena for a clash that would determine the fate of the world. The Persian army that gathered at Gaugamela was astonishing in scale. Ancient historians speak of hundreds of thousands of soldiers drawn from every corner of the empire: Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Armenians, Babylonians, Syrians, and even Indian war elephants. Creatures Alexander had never faced before. The sheer size of the camp, the endless rows of tents, and the glow of countless fires were said to fill the horizon. Darius placed himself in the center of the formation, atop a high chariot, painted in royal colors, surrounded by elite bodyguards and banners shimmering in the desert light. The great king stood ready, not only to defend his empire, but to avenge his earlier humiliation. Alexander, by contrast, arrived with a significantly smaller force, roughly 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. But what his army lacked in size, it more than made up for, in disciplined training and unwavering loyalty to their king. They had marched thousands of miles, conquered city after city, and defied every statistic. They believed in Alexander as much as they believed in their own weapons. His presence, calm, fearless, radiant, was a force multiplier stronger than any number of troops. On the eve of battle, Alexander consulted with scouts who had surveyed the Persian position. He spent the night studying the terrain, the formations, and the weaknesses within the seemingly overwhelming Persian lines. While many commanders would have been overwhelmed by the sight of such a massive force, Alexander saw something else: opportunity. He understood that a large army is powerful only when it can coordinate and concentrate force. If he could disrupt Darius's ability to direct his massive host, the entire Persian line might unravel. He didn't need to destroy the entire army, he needed to strike at its heart. At dawn, under a pale desert sky, the Macedonians formed their battle lines. Alexander took command of the right flank with his companion cavalry, while his trusted general Parmenion commanded the left. The phalanx stood firm in the center, its long sarissa spears glinting with the first rays of sunlight. The Macedonian army marched forward in a diagonal formation, drifting deliberately to the right. It was a subtle maneuver, but a brilliant one. Alexander was baiting the Persian cavalry, drawing them outward, stretching the Persian line, and exposing a weakness the center. Darius watched with growing concern as Alexander executed this unexpected movement. He responded by ordering his left-wing cavalry to swing wide and envelop the Macedonians. But this was exactly what Alexander wanted. As the Persian cavalry surged forward eager to outflank him, they inadvertently created a gap, a narrow corridor between the Persian center and the engaged cavalry wing. Alexander had crafted this moment with precision. This was the opening he had been waiting for. With perfect timing, Alexander shouted the command. The companion cavalry, armored and powerful, wheeled sharply and charged directly into the exposed gap. They formed a wedge with Alexander at its tip, his plumed helmet gleaming. His spear lowered his voice, urging his men forward. The charge was explosive. Macedonian horses thundered across the plain, smashing through the disoriented infantry who had been left to guard the Persian center. Dust filled the air, spears splintered, and cries of shock erupted as Alexander carved a direct path toward one target, Darius III. This was the oblique attack, a strategy in which the commander advances one wing while refusing the other, creating asymmetry and exploiting openings. Alexander executed it with such speed and precision that Darius had no time to reinforce his center. Alexander's wedge pierced deeper. He cut down Persian nobles' bodyguards and anyone who dared block his path. According to some accounts, he came within a spear's length of Darius. For the second time, the great king faced a horrifying sight, Alexander charging toward him with unstoppable force. And for the second time, Darius lost his nerve. Despite commanding the largest army in the world, despite preparing the battlefield meticulously, despite having every numerical advantage imaginable, Darius turned and fled. His chariot spun around, scattering bodyguards and soldiers in its wake. The moment the great king fled, the morale of the Persian army shattered instantly. Panic spread like wildfire. Units began to retreat, then collapse entirely. The empire's proud warriors, seeing their king abandon the field, followed him in a chaotic retreat. Alexander had won. But the battle was not yet over across the field. On the Macedonian left flank, Parmenion was struggling under the weight of a massive Persian cavalry assault. Seeing his flank in danger, Alexander faced a choice: pursue Darius immediately and perhaps end the war that day, or turn back to save his men. He chose loyalty over glory. Another example of the leadership that made his army willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. Alexander turned his cavalry around and rode full speed back across the battlefield, smashing into the Persian forces attacking Parmenion. The Macedonian left flank stabilized, the Persian army broke entirely, and the battle became a rout. It was a complete victory, a defeat so total, so devastating, that the Persian Empire never recovered. When the sun set on Gaugamela, the fate of the ancient world had changed forever. Darius fled eastward, a broken king in a broken empire. Alexander marched into the heart of Persia, claiming Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis one after another. He became not just a conqueror, but the new ruler of the Persian world. Gaugamela was not just a military triumph, it was the death knell of an empire. And it was the moment Alexander became undeniably Alexander the Great. When the dust settled at Gaugamela and the Persian army scattered into the vastness of the east, Alexander the Great stood victorious on the field, but not fulfilled. Most kings would have considered the battle the final chapter of their conquest. Persia had been utterly defeated. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the jewels of the empire opened their gates to him without resistance. The Persian treasury fell into his hands, granting him unimaginable wealth. And the world recognized him as the most powerful man alive. But Alexander had never been driven solely by conquest. He sought something far greater, the right to stand in the place of kings, not just as a conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to the ancient line of Persian rulers. To achieve that, he needed one thing: Darius III alive and defeated, bowing before him, acknowledging him as the new great king. This desire was not born merely of pride or ambition. It came from Alexander's deeply ingrained belief that rulership was not simply taken by force, it was assumed through continuity. Philip II had taught him the importance of legitimacy. Aristotle had taught him the principles of lawful succession. And Alexander, shaped by both philosophy and empire building, believed that replacing a king required more than defeating his army. He needed Darius himself. In Alexander's mind, capturing Darius alive would end the war with honor. It would show the Persian nobility, the satraps, and the eastern provinces that the Macedonian king was not an invader, but the rightful heir to Asia. It would also allow him to show magnanimity, as he had with Darius's captured family, an act that had already earned him respect and admiration across Persia. But Darius did not wait for such an encounter. After Gaugamela, he fled eastward into Media, then further toward Bactria, gathering what loyal forces remained. His authority, however, was crumbling. Persian nobles blamed him for the defeats, and faith in his leadership evaporated. Still, Darius maintained one last hope to reach the eastern satrapies, raise another army, and continue resisting Alexander. Alexander's pursuit of Darius was relentless. He did not linger in his newly conquered capitals. He paused only long enough to secure garrisons, reorganize administration, and ensure the loyalty of local governors before setting off again. His soldiers marched across scorching deserts, treacherous mountain ranges, and harsh plateaus, pushing deeper into territories known for harsh weather and fierce tribal resistance. Yet, Alexander pressed forward, driven by a singular purpose: to catch Darius before he disappeared into the far edges of his empire. The chase became one of the most grueling episodes of the entire campaign. Macedonian troops marched through the Zagros Mountains, enduring freezing winds and brutal terrain. Alexander encouraged them personally, sharing their hardships, eating the same food, and refusing privileges. His men followed him, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in him, believed in the destiny he so fiercely embodied. With every village, fortress, and satrapy they passed, Alexander's influence grew. Persian nobles began defecting, some offering assistance, others simply bowing to the inevitable. Each defection weakened Darius's position further. Eventually, the great king's last loyal companions dwindled to a handful of satraps and nobles' men who were loyal, not out of devotion, but because they feared the consequences of surrender. One of these men was Bessus satrap of Bactria. Ambitious, calculating, and dangerous, Bessus recognized that Darius's authority was collapsing. He also recognized that Alexander's rise was unstoppable. In this shifting political landscape, Bessus began to form a plan, not to save Persia, but to seize it for himself. In his mind, Darius was a liability, but if he could eliminate the great king and proclaim himself successor, He might rally the eastern tribes against Alexander and revive the empire under his own rule. As Darius and his dwindling entourage retreated further east, Bessus and a group of conspirators made their move. When they realized Alexander was quickly closing the distance, they grew desperate. They arrested Darius, bound him, and attempted to use him as leverage. But even as a prisoner, Darius refused to cooperate. He would not negotiate with traitors. He would not serve as a puppet for Bessus. And so, faced with a useless captive and the terrifying prospect of Alexander's imminent arrival, Bessus chose the path of cowardice disguised as pragmatism. Darius III, the last king of the Achaemenid Empire, was stabbed and left to die in the back of a wagon on the dirt road toward Bactria. It was a pathetic and dishonorable end for a king of such ancient lineage. Bessus and his conspirators fled, leaving the dying king behind as they made their way east to declare a new rebellion. Shortly after, Alexander's advance guard discovered the abandoned wagon. Inside lay Darius, bleeding and fading fast, but still alive. The Macedonian soldiers approached with caution, then called for Alexander. When Alexander arrived, he knelt beside the dying king. Darius, unable to speak fully reportedly, expressed gratitude that Alexander had treated his family with kindness and asked for the dignity of a proper burial. He urged Alexander to avenge him, not for Persia's sake, but for justice. Then, in the presence of the man who had chased him halfway across Asia, Darius took his final breath. The moment was deeply symbolic. Alexander covered the king's body with his own cloak, a gesture of respect, and declared that Darius would receive the burial owed to a great king of Persia. But beneath the solemnity was a storm of emotion. Darius's death robbed Alexander of the conclusion he had desired. He did not want a dead king. He wanted a defeated one. He wanted to inherit the empire through legitimacy, not through a corpse abandoned in a wagon. Alexander's grief quickly turned into fury. But it was not directed at Darius, only at those who murdered him. Bessus had attempted to steal Alexander's victory, to usurp the throne, and to paint himself as the new sovereign of Persia. To Alexander, this was more than treachery. It was an affront to kingship itself. Bessus had violated the sacred rule of royal honor. Kings were to face their enemies openly, not die at the hands of cowards seeking power. In that moment, Alexander took on a new role, not just conqueror, not just successor, but avenger. He vowed to pursue Bessus across the distant east into lands even the Persians barely controlled. It was no longer merely a military campaign. It was a moral mission. Bessus had to be punished. Justice had to be served. This pursuit took Alexander deeper into Central Asia, into Bactria, Sogdiana, and the wild frontier regions beyond. The terrain grew harsher, the resistance fiercer, the distances longer. Many of his men believed they had already accomplished the impossible. Yet Alexander drove them forward, fueled by his oath to Darius and his desire to unite the empire under a single legitimate crown. When Bessus was finally captured, betrayed by his own allies, Alexander delivered judgment not as a Macedonian king, but as the new great king of Persia. Bessus was tried, mutilated according to Persian custom for royal treason, and executed. It was both vengeance and symbolism. The boy who had once idolized Achilles now avenged Darius as a Persian king would avenge a murdered predecessor. Through this act, Alexander achieved what he had long desired. He was no longer merely a conqueror of Persia. He became the rightful ruler of Persia, the man who avenged its fallen king and restored honor to its throne. And with Darius III dead, Alexander's path was clear. Further east, further into mystery, and further into the destiny he believed the gods had carved for him. With Darius III dead and the Persian heartland under Macedonian control, many expected Alexander to pause, perhaps even to return home crowned in glory. But Alexander had no intention of stopping. The death of Darius opened not an ending, but a new frontier. Beyond Persia lay the wild, rugged lands of Bactria and Sogdiana regions known to the Greeks only through myth and rumor. These territories, stretching across modern-day Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, were remote, mountainous, fiercely independent, and nearly impossible to control. For centuries, even the mighty Persian Empire struggled to maintain authority there. Now, it was Alexander's turn. From the moment he marched into Central Asia, Alexander encountered challenges unlike anything he had faced in Persia, Egypt, or Asia Minor. The terrain itself was a ruthless enemy. Jagged mountains cut across the land like broken teeth. Deep valleys hid scattered villages and fortified settlements carved into cliffs. Climate extremes battered Alexander's men, blistering heat in the deserts, freezing winds in the highlands, and sudden storms that turned paths into rivers of mud. Macedonian phalanxes so effective on the open plains found themselves scrambling up steep passes and narrow ravines where formations were nearly impossible to maintain. But geography was only the beginning of the struggle. Central Asia was home to warrior tribes who valued independence above all else. Unlike the Persians, who relied on formal armies and organized defense, the Sogdians and Bactrians fought in small mobile groups, masters of guerrilla warfare, long before the term existed. They struck at night, ambushed supply lines, vanished into mountains, and refused open battle. Their tactics frustrated Alexander's generals and exhausted his soldiers. Progress was painfully slow. Victories were fleeting. Each time Alexander captured a fortress or routed a band of rebels, another uprising erupted somewhere else. This resistance was not centralized. There was no single king to defeat no capital, to seize no clear objective that would symbolize victory. Instead, Alexander faced scattered pockets of defiance, led by tribal chiefs, rebel nobles, and even self-proclaimed kings. Among the most infamous of these was Spitamenes, a brilliant Sogdian leader who proved to be one of Alexander's most dangerous opponents. Spitamenes was unpredictable, swift, and knew the terrain intimately. He launched surprise attacks, rallied local support, and even defeated several Macedonian detachments. His hit-and-run tactics bewildered an army trained for direct confrontation. For the first time in his campaign, Alexander's momentum faltered, but Alexander was a master of adaptation. If the terrain prevented conventional warfare, he would change his tactics. He broke his army into smaller, highly mobile units capable of moving quickly through mountains and deserts. He learned to anticipate ambushes, to cut off escape routes, and to strike with precision. He adopted local strategies, used native scouts, and exploited divisions among the rebels. He also built new cities, garrison towns meant to serve as strategic footholds in the hostile region. These became centers of Greek-influenced supply bases and symbols of Macedonian control. Alexander's persistence paid off. One by one, fortresses fell. One by one, tribal leaders submitted or were destroyed. Spitamenes, betrayed by his own allies, after suffering a major defeat, was killed, his head presented to Alexander as a grim trophy. Yet even as resistance waned, the cost of the campaign weighed heavily on Alexander's men. The unending marches, the unfamiliar climate, and the constant threats stretched their endurance to its limit. Many wondered why their king seemed determined to push further into the unknown rather than return home to enjoy the fruits of victory. For Alexander, however, Central Asia was more than a battleground. It was a crossroads of cultures and a laboratory for his most ambitious idea, the fusion of Macedonian and Persian worlds. He understood that conquering these territories by force alone would never secure lasting stability. The people of Bactria and Sogdiana could not be ruled solely through soldiers and walls. They needed a connection to the new empire, a sense of belonging, and so Alexander turned to diplomacy symbolism, and perhaps most famously, marriage. During the Central Asian campaign, Alexander's path crossed with a young Bactrian noblewoman named Roxana, the daughter of a local satrap. According to ancient historians, Alexander first saw her after the capture of a rebel fortress known as the Rock of Sogdiana. Roxana, renowned for her beauty, grace, and intelligence, made an immediate impression. But Alexander's decision to marry her was not a mere romantic gesture. It was a political masterstroke. By taking Roxana as his wife, Alexander sought to bridge the gap between Macedonian rulers and Central Asian elites. It was a symbolic union meant to show that he did not intend to rule as a foreign conqueror, but as a king who respected and embraced the cultures of the lands he governed. The marriage caused mixed reactions. Some Macedonian officers disapproved, feeling Alexander was abandoning Greek traditions. But many Persians and Central Asians interpreted it as an honorable gesture, proof that Alexander saw them not as subjects, but as partners in his expanding empire. The marriage to Roxana became the first of many similar acts of cultural integration. Alexander adopted aspects of Persian dress court rituals and administrative practices. He encouraged intermarriage between his soldiers and local women. He recruited Central Asians into his army and educated their children in Greek language and customs. His vision was unprecedented. He wanted to create a blended empire, a world where Greek and Eastern traditions merged into a single unified civilization. But this vision was not universally welcomed. Macedonian soldiers, proud of their heritage, resented what they saw as favoritism toward the conquered. They whispered that their king had become too Persian, that he was forgetting his roots. Tensions grew, leading to conflicts, dark moments like the killing of Clytus, the Black One, of Alexander's closest companions during a drunken argument fueled by cultural strain. Yet Alexander pressed ahead. His determination to merge cultures was not a fleeting experiment. It was the core of his imperial philosophy. He believed that unity required more than conquest. It required shared identity. Central Asia became the proving ground for that belief. The construction of cities like Alexandria, Eskete, Alexandria, the furthest, symbolized his desire to spread Greek culture to the edges of the known world, while also welcoming local customs, languages, and beliefs. By the time Alexander finally pacified Sogdiana and Bactria, the region was transformed. Not fully Greek, not purely Persian, but something new, a blend of influences that would echo through history for centuries. Greek art, language, and architecture mingled with Central Asian traditions, giving rise to unique cultural and economic exchanges. The Silk Road would later carry these influences across continents, shaping civilizations far beyond Alexander's lifetime. For the Macedonian king, the conquest of Central Asia was both a triumph and a turning point. The physical and emotional trials hardened him, deepened his ambitions, and fueled his conviction that he was destined to unify the world under a single rule. The marriage to Roxana symbolized his commitment to that idea. The fusion of cultures embodied the empire he dreamed of, and the pacification of the rebel lands proved his ability not just to win battles, but to reshape societies. As he prepared to march further east into India, a land of mystery elephants and kingdoms, even the Persians feared Alexander carried with him not only the momentum of conquest, but the blueprint of a new world. A world where East and West no longer stood divided, where a Macedonian king could call himself the successor of Persian rulers, where cultures blended instead of clashing. In the rugged heart of Central Asia, Alexander achieved something deeper than victory. He forged an empire not merely through force, but through vision, a vision that would continue to evolve, challenge, and inspire as he pushed toward the horizons that lay ahead. By the time Alexander completed the long and brutal conquest of Central Asia, his empire stretched farther than any Greek had ever imagined. Most of his generals believed the campaign should end there. The soldiers, hardened by relentless marches, unforgiving mountains, and ruthless guerrilla warfare, longed for rest. They had left home years earlier and carried the scars of battles fought in foreign lands. Yet Alexander's ambition had only grown. The world as he saw it did not end in Bactria or even in Persia. To him, the true horizon lay further east in the mysterious land the Greeks called India, a place whispered about in stories of vast rivers, mighty kings, and strange beasts. For Alexander, India was both a challenge and a destiny. Ancient Greek philosophers had described it as the edge of the known world, a place where myth and reality blurred together. Aristotle himself had spoken of lands beyond Persia filled with wonders. Alexander, shaped by these tales and driven by an insatiable desire to surpass every conqueror before him, felt compelled to press on. To turn back now would mean accepting limits, and Alexander did not believe in limits. But the men who followed him saw things differently. They had marched thousands of miles, crossed deserts that felt endless, and fought enemies who seemed to spring from the earth itself. Their armor was dented, their horses exhausted, their hearts heavy with longing for home. Still, when Alexander announced the next phase of his campaign, they obeyed. Their trust in him had been forged through victory after victory. If he said India was their next destination, then India would be conquered. The journey south and east from Bactria into the Indian subcontinent was long and treacherous. Alexander first crossed the Hindu Kush mountain range for a second time, one of the most grueling passages in the ancient world. Snowstorms battered his men. Narrow passes turned deadly when pack animals slipped and fell into ravines. Supplies ran thin, yet Alexander pressed forward, urging his army with the same passionate resolve that had carried them through every trial. As they descended from the mountains and entered the region of the Indus River, the landscape changed dramatically. The arid peaks and barren valleys gave way to fertile plains, dense forests, and vast rivers that stretched far beyond anything the Macedonians had seen. The people were different too. Diverse tribes, fortified cities, and kingdoms with their own ancient traditions greeted Alexander. Some surrendered willingly, astonished by the arrival of the Macedonian king. Others resisted fiercely. Unlike Persia, India was not a single empire. It was a tapestry of small kingdoms and tribal states, each ruled independently and often at odds with one another. Alexander exploited these divisions masterfully. He formed alliances with some rulers, subdued others through diplomacy, and reserved his full military might for those who dared to challenge him openly. One of the first major obstacles was the fortress city of Aornos, perched high on a mountain spur overlooking the Indus. The locals boasted that even Heracles had failed to capture it, a claim that immediately intrigued Alexander. He would not allow a legend to stand unchallenged. With determination bordering on obsession, he orchestrated a daring assault, building embankments and scaling cliffs until he took the fortress. It was a symbolic victory, one that solidified his belief that no barrier, natural or man-made, could halt his progress. As Alexander moved deeper into India, he encountered enemies unlike any he had faced before. Persian armies had relied on cavalry and archers. Central Asian rebels had relied on guerrilla tactics. But the Indian kingdoms introduced a terrifying new element to the battlefield: war elephants. To the Macedonians, who had never seen such creatures, elephants were towering monsters. Massive beasts, armored for war, capable of trampling soldiers and shattering phalanx formations. Their trumpeting roars, their size, and their sheer momentum filled even hardened veterans with dread. Alexander, however, was fascinated. He studied them, learning their weaknesses, analyzing how they were deployed, and preparing his men to confront them. The greatest test of this new challenge came when Alexander reached the banks of the Hydaspes River, modern-day Jhelum, where he encountered King Porus, ruler of a vast and powerful kingdom. Unlike many other rulers who either fled or submitted, Porus stood proudly in Alexander's path, a towering warrior said to be over 6 feet tall, noble in demeanor, and commanding an army that included more than 200 war elephants. He refused to surrender. He refused to negotiate. He prepared for battle. Alexander admired him instantly. The Hydaspes River was swollen by monsoon rains, its currents swift and dangerous. Porus stationed his forces on the opposite bank, watching carefully for any attempt at crossing. A direct assault would have been suicidal. Alexander needed to outthink his opponent, so he devised one of the most complex river-crossing maneuvers in ancient warfare. For days, Alexander moved his cavalry up and down the riverbank, creating the illusion of preparation while searching for a viable crossing point. The constant feints kept Porus alert and uncertain. Finally, under the cover of a violent thunderstorm, Alexander led a portion of his army across the river at a location hidden by wooded islands. The crossing was treacherous. Men and horses struggled against the current, but Alexander's leadership held them together. When Porus realized what was happening, he marched out to confront the Macedonians, bringing his elephants to the front lines. What followed was one of the most brutal and extraordinary battles of Alexander's career. The elephants charged first, their massive forms shaking the earth beneath them. Macedonian horses panicked, throwing riders. Infantry formations buckled under the weight of the advancing beasts. Men were crushed, hurled aside, or gored by tusks. The air filled with screams and the terrifying trumpet of elephants driven into battle. But Alexander adapted quickly. He ordered his phalanx to widen their ranks, allowing the elephants to pass through while striking at their unarmored sides. His cavalry targeted Porus's flanks, isolating units and preventing coordinated attacks. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, nothing like the disciplined battles he had fought in Persia. Porus himself fought with extraordinary courage, refusing to retreat even after being wounded repeatedly. He launched counterattacks, rallied his troops, and stood tall atop his elephant, a figure of royal defiance. Witnessing this, Alexander felt a rare sense of admiration for his opponent, a respect that would shape the aftermath of the battle. Eventually, the tide turned. The elephants, injured and frightened, began to rampage through their own lines. Indian infantry scattered. Porus, exhausted and bleeding, refused to surrender until his soldiers finally urged him to accept defeat. When brought before Alexander, the Macedonian king asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus answered with a single word. Like a king, Alexander smiled. You shall have everything a king deserves. In an unprecedented act of honor, Alexander restored Porus to his throne and even expanded his territory. This decision stunned his generals, but earned Alexander the loyalty of countless Indian rulers who saw in him not just a conqueror, but a leader capable of respecting bravery and nobility even in an enemy. Yet the victory at Hydaspes marked a turning point in Alexander's campaign, not because of defeat, but because of exhaustion. His men, battered by years of constant warfare and shaken by the ferocity of the elephants, refused to march further east. They had heard tales of the Ganges of armies even larger than Porus's, and of lands without end. The dream of reaching the Eastern Ocean, Alexander's last great ambition, was more than they could bear. For the first time in his reign, Alexander's army said no. Standing on the banks of the Hyphasis River, looking toward the unknown east, Alexander faced the bitter reality that even his legendary will could not overcome exhaustion and human limits. With a heavy heart, he agreed to turn back. The decision marked the end of his eastward expansion, though not the end of his dreams. India had given Alexander some of the most difficult battles of his life and some of the greatest lessons. He had confronted new cultures, new strategies, and new enemies that tested him in ways Persia never had. He left the subcontinent not as a conqueror who dominated absolutely, but as a visionary who sought to understand, integrate, and transform. The Eastern dream was not completed, but the mark it left on Alexander and the world was permanent. By the time Alexander reached the banks of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, he had faced nearly every kind of battlefield the ancient world could offer: open plains, fortified cities, desert ambushes, mountain strongholds, yet nothing had prepared him for what awaited on this storm-lashed frontier of India. Here, under monsoon skies and along the roaring waters of the Hydaspes, Alexander confronted one of the most formidable opponents of his entire campaign, King Porus, a towering monarch commanding war elephants, chariots, and hardy infantry, unlike anything in the Macedonian experience. The battle that followed would become legendary, not because it was Alexander's largest or bloodiest, but because it pushed him to the absolute limits of his tactical genius, physical endurance, and emotional depth. The Hydaspes River was no ordinary obstacle. Swollen by monsoon rains, its currents raged like a living beast, churning mud, uprooting trees, and smashing debris against its banks. Waves crashed onto the muddy shore with relentless force. The river was wide, unpredictable, and treacherous, utterly unsuitable for a conventional crossing. And on the opposite bank, watching every movement with alert and disciplined eyes, stood King Porus. Porus was not a fleeing Persian satrap or divided tribal leader. He was a sovereign ruler with a unified army, fierce loyalty, and a deep understanding of his terrain. He deployed his war elephants along the riverbank in a line that seemed impenetrable. Their massive bodies, steel-plated armor, and great tusks created a wall of living muscle. Behind them waited infantry and cavalry, all ready to crush any Macedonian attempt to cross. Porus made one thing clear: if Alexander wanted India, he would have to earn it. For days, Alexander rode up and down the riverbank, testing points where he might cross. Each time, Porus mirrored his movements, shadowing him with his own forces. It was a chess match across a river, a duel of patience, deception, and psychological warfare. Alexander knew that a direct crossing in front of Porus's army would be suicidal, but he also knew that Porus, like most kings, expected a straightforward attack. Alexander set out to break that expectation. On a night when the sky tore open with lightning and rain hammered the earth in torrents, Alexander made his move. Hidden by darkness and the noise of the storm, he led a chosen force upriver, infantry, cavalry, and elite units, while leaving behind decoys to keep Porus guessing. The storm, terrifying to his men, was a gift from the gods to Alexander. The roar of thunder drowned out his army's movements. The sheets of rain concealed their shapes, and the storm-soaked paths left Porus uncertain about what he was hearing, or whether he was hearing anything at all. When Alexander reached a wooded island mid-river, he paused only long enough for his men to gather their courage. Then, risking everything, he plunged into the raging waters. The crossing was chaotic. Men were swept away by currents. Horses balked and reared in panic. Officers shouted to maintain order, but the storm drowned out their voices. Even Alexander struggled to keep Bucephalus stable against the swirling river. But the king pressed forward, driven by the same unbreakable will that had carried him across continents. Gradually, painfully, the Macedonian force reached the far bank, soaked, exhausted, but united and ready. They had crossed the Hydaspes, but the battle was only beginning. Porus had been deceived temporarily, but not for long. When he learned of Alexander's crossing, he marched quickly to meet him with a portion of his army. He sent his son at the head of a cavalry force to strike first, hoping to push Alexander back into the river. The clash was fierce, but Alexander's cavalry overwhelmed the attack, killing Porus's son and driving the force into retreat. Then Porus himself arrived, leading an army unlike any Alexander had ever faced. The war elephants stood at the front, their massive forms towering over Macedonian soldiers. Behind them, chariots rolled forward, and infantry advanced in disciplined ranks. Porus himself rode atop a gigantic elephant clad in armor, carrying a long spear and radiating regal confidence. The sight of him commanding from the back of a beast that dwarfed even cavalry horses made an impression on Alexander that would last the rest of his life. The battle commenced with a thunderous charge of the elephants. The ground shook beneath them. Macedonian troops were crushed underfoot, ripped apart, or hurled aside. Horses panicked, collapsing phalanx formations as riders struggled to maintain control. The elephants smashed their way into Alexander's lines, creating chaos that spread like wildfire. Men who had marched for years across Persia and Central Asia now faced their most terrifying enemy. For a moment, the Macedonian line wavered, but Alexander adapted. He ordered his infantry to form wider intervals, allowing elephants to pass through rather than smashing into solid lines. As the elephants moved between the ranks, Macedonian soldiers struck at their legs, sides, and handlers. Cavalry units targeted the flanks of Porus's forces, isolating pockets of resistance and preventing the elephants from coordinating their attacks. Archers aimed at the elephants' eyes, the most vulnerable spot on their armored bodies. Still, the battle was brutal. Elephants rampaged uncontrollably when wounded, trampling both friend and foe. Porus fought with awe-inspiring courage, standing tall atop his elephant, directing his forces amidst the chaos. His presence inspired his soldiers to fight beyond fear, beyond fatigue. No Persian king had ever stood this firmly against Alexander. No opponent had matched his courage, blow for blow. Alexander, recognizing Porus's strength, knew he needed to break the Indian formation strategically, not through sheer force. His cavalry darted in and out, wearing down the enemy and slowly encircling them. The phalanx pushed relentlessly, step by step, turning chaos into momentum. Gradually, the elephants began to tire their attacks, growing less coordinated. The turning point came when the elephants, exhausted and injured, caused disarray among their own troops. Some fled, some collapsed, some turned wild. Alexander seized the moment, ordering a full advance. Porus's army, valiant and disciplined, began to falter. When the dust settled, Porus was wounded, bleeding, and surrounded, but unbroken. Even in defeat, he remained upright on his elephant, refusing to flee or surrender dishonorably. His bravery was undeniable, his dignity intact. Alexander approached him, not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the respect of one warrior acknowledging another. When Porus was asked how he wished to be treated, he answered with a simple but legendary phrase, "Like a king." Alexander's response was pure admiration. "You shall have everything a king deserves." It was one of the most remarkable acts of respect in ancient warfare. Instead of imprisoning Porus or stripping him of power, Alexander restored him to his throne and even granted him more territory than he had ruled before the battle. To the Macedonians, this decision seemed unbelievable. Porus had fought them fiercely. But Alexander understood something deeper. India could not be conquered by force alone. It needed rulers like Porus, respected, loyal, and capable of maintaining order under Alexander's larger vision. This moment marked a turning point, not only in the campaign, but in Alexander's philosophy of leadership. He was no longer merely a conqueror. He was becoming a world builder, one who could recognize greatness in others and elevate allies instead of extinguishing them. The Battle of the Hydaspes was not Alexander's largest battle, but it was arguably his most challenging. He faced a powerful king, an unfamiliar environment, terrifying war elephants, and a river swollen by storms. He faced tactics he had never seen, weapons he had never fought, and a commander whose courage matched his own. And he triumphed not only through might, but through brilliance, adaptability, and respect. But the cost was high. His army was exhausted, shaken by the ferocity of the elephants, and weary from years of continuous war. Though Alexander pressed onward, the Hydaspes marked the beginning of the limits of his men's endurance, a limit that would soon be reached. Yet the legacy of Hydaspes lived on. It showed Alexander at his best, fearless, brilliant, and noble. It showed Porus at his finest, proud, honorable, and unbreakable. And it symbolized the moment when two great kings recognized each other, not as enemies, but as equals in the eyes of history. By the time Alexander reached the furthest stretches of the Indian subcontinent, the world he had conquered was astonishing in scale. From Greece to Egypt, from Persia to Central Asia, and now deep into northern India, the Macedonian king had carved out an empire that no mortal before him had ever achieved. But as the map of his conquests expanded, something else began to change, something he had not anticipated, something no battlefield victory could prevent. His empire had grown too vast, and the men who followed him had grown too tired. For nearly a decade, Alexander's army had marched relentlessly across continents, fighting endless battles, crossing deserts and mountains, facing elephants and monsoons. Their bodies were hardened, but their spirits were weary. Many had left Macedonia as young men and were now approaching middle age. Some had not seen their families for years. Others had watched friends die in foreign lands, with no chance of burial at home. Alexander, consumed by his dream of reaching the Eastern Ocean, and perhaps even circling the entire world, seemed blind to their exhaustion. After the victory over Porus at the Hydaspes, Alexander pushed further east. His eyes were fixed on the great Ganges River, a place rumored to be guarded by armies far larger than anything he had yet encountered. He dreamed of new horizons, new lands to explore, and new conquests that would surpass the legends of Heracles and Dionysus. But his army had reached their limit. When they arrived at the banks of the Hyphasis River, modern-day Bias, the soldiers gathered not in formation, but in protest. It was not an open rebellion, but a collective plea, a refusal born not of disloyalty, but of sheer exhaustion. Coenus, one of Alexander's most respected generals, stepped forward as their voice. With honesty and reverence, he told the king what his men could no longer bear. Your soldiers long for home. They have nothing left to give. Do not lead them against armies we cannot imagine. Alexander was stunned. For the first time in his reign, the army he had inspired beyond human limits stood firm against him. Their refusal struck deeper than any wound he had endured in battle. He withdrew to his tent for days, refusing to speak or eat. Some said he mourned the death of his dreams. Others believed he was angry at what he saw as betrayal. But ultimately, Alexander understood. Ambition, even divine ambition, cannot ignore human limits forever. At last, he emerged and declared that the army would turn back. The decision was met with relief and gratitude from his men. But for Alexander, it was a moment of profound disappointment. He had intended to push to the edge of the world. Now, he would return not in triumph, but in resignation. Returning from India was no peaceful march. Alexander chose to divide his forces part, would sail down the Indus River, while another marched through harsh terrain. Alexander himself led a contingent across the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Whether this was a strategic necessity or a deliberate challenge inspired by pride remains debated by historians. What is certain is that the crossing was catastrophic. The desert punished the Macedonians with searing heat, sandstorms, dehydration, and starvation. Many soldiers perished. Pack animals collapsed. Supplies burned in the relentless sun. Alexander, as always, shared in the suffering, refusing water, unless his men also drank. but even his presence could not prevent the devastating losses. By the time they emerged from the desert months later, the army was severely reduced and deeply scarred. Their loyalty remained, but their spirits were fractured. Upon returning to Persia, Alexander expected to resume his role as a triumphant king. Instead, he discovered that his absence had allowed corruption, rebellion, and mismanagement to flourish. Governors appointed during his long campaign had abused their power, extorted local populations, and enriched themselves. Alexander responded with swift and sometimes brutal punishment, executing or replacing officials who had betrayed their duties. But his anger did not stop there. In his quest to unify the empire, Alexander had adopted many Persian customs, royal dress ceremonies, even the practice of proskynesis, a ritual bow or prostration. To the Persians, these acts symbolized respect and legitimacy. To his Macedonian companions, they symbolized betrayal. Alexander's efforts to blend cultures, marriages, mixed units of soldiers, administrative integration were seen as visionary by some, but deeply threatening by others. His closest men whispered that he was becoming too Persian. Tension simmered beneath the surface. The spark that ignited this tension came with the murder of Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest friends, and the man who had saved his life at the Battle of Granicus. During a drunken banquet, Clitus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and implied he was forgetting his Macedonian roots. Enraged and intoxicated, Alexander seized a spear and killed Clitus on the spot. The horror of what he had done struck Alexander immediately. This was no enemy, this was a friend, a brother in arms, a man who had stood beside him in battle. Alexander mourned deeply, locking himself away in grief and guilt. The incident revealed cracks in his emotional stability, strained from years of war, and the isolation that comes from absolute power. The most significant challenge to Alexander's authority came in Opis near Babylon, where he announced a sweeping policy, the integration of Persian soldiers into the Macedonian army. He planned to send aging Macedonian veterans home with rewards, replacing them with newly trained Persian units. Instead of gratitude, Alexander faced a mutiny. The soldiers saw his plan as a dismissal of their service, a betrayal of their sacrifices. They accused him of favoring Persians over his own men. They shouted that he was no longer their king. For a moment, it seemed as though the loyalty that had carried Alexander across Asia had finally shattered. Alexander responded with fury. He ordered the execution of the ringleaders and dismissed the entire army, declaring he would continue the conquest with Persians alone. The soldiers, shocked and terrified at the thought of losing their king's favor, begged forgiveness. Alexander relented, embracing their commanders, tears flowing as he reconciled with the army he loved. It was a powerful moment of healing, but it also revealed how fragile unity had become. By now, Alexander was a man transformed. Once a brilliant youthful conqueror, he had become a ruler, carrying the burden of a vast, restless empire. His dreams had grown too big for the world he lived in. He spoke increasingly of new campaigns. Arabia, Carthage, the Western Mediterranean, plans that exhausted even his closest advisors. The soldiers loved him, but they feared what another decade of war would bring. The satraps respected him, but they feared his wrath. His friends adored him, but some quietly doubted his path. The unity that had once propelled him across Asia was held together now by the weight of his personality alone. Alexander still believed he was meant to reshape the world, but the world and the men who lived in it were reaching their limits. The years of campaigning had created fractures that could not be easily repaired. Exhaustion had worn down the army's loyalty. Cultural blending had alienated many Macedonian nobles. Personal tragedies had unsettled Alexander emotionally. The sheer size of the empire made control increasingly impossible. Opposition simmered everywhere from soldiers to satraps. The unstoppable momentum that had defined Alexander's rise was beginning to slow, and those around him could feel it. He was still the greatest general in the world, still a king of unmatched charisma, still a visionary whose ambitions soared beyond imagination. But even a legend must confront the limits of human endurance. As Alexander prepared new expansions and dreamed of new horizons, the foundation beneath him, his army, his companions, his empire was beginning to crack. The world he had conquered was too vast, and the loyalty that had carried him so far was beginning to splinter. When Alexander finally turned his army westward and made the long journey back toward the heart of his empire, he was no longer the young king who had crossed the Hellespont a decade earlier. His body bore the marks of countless battles, scars, old wounds, and a growing fatigue he refused to acknowledge. His mind, though sharper than ever, carried the weight of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Yet beneath the exhaustion, beneath the years of hardship, and the strain of holding together a world he had conquered, one thing remained unchanged: his hunger for more. Alexander's return to Babylon in 323 BCE was not a retreat. It was a recalibration. Babylon, ancient, wealthy, thriving, was the perfect place to establish the capital of a global empire. It was the crossroads of East and West, the center of commerce, culture, and political influence. Alexander envisioned it not simply as his administrative capital, but as the foundation of a new world order, a realm unified under one king, one culture blended from many, one destiny shaped by his own hand. But Alexander's dreams were far from complete. Even after pushing his army to the edge of the known world and back, Alexander's imagination soared beyond the boundaries of maps. As soon as he settled in Babylon, he began planning the next phase of conquest, an expansion that would have reshaped the ancient world even more dramatically than his victories in Persia and India. His first target was Arabia, a vast region, rich in trade spices, rare goods, and maritime routes. With its desert tribes and independent cities, Arabia represented both a challenge and an opportunity. Alexander envisioned building coastal ports, creating a navy, and turning the Arabian Peninsula into part of his empire's economic lifeline. The conquest of Arabia, he believed, would secure the Persian Gulf and open routes leading further south. But Arabia was only the beginning. Alexander's ambitions extended toward the greatest powers of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage and Italy. Carthage, with its mighty navy and immense wealth, was a dominion that commanded the western seas. Its merchant fleets dominated trade routes, its generals were feared, and its presence rivaled the might of any Eastern empire. Alexander saw Carthage not just as a threat to his future vision, but as an essential piece of the world he wished to unify. Controlling Carthage meant controlling the Western Mediterranean, Africa, and the gateway to the Atlantic. And beyond Carthage lay another rising power, Rome. At the time, Rome was not yet the empire it would one day become. It was a growing republic, expanding its influence throughout the Italian peninsula. Alexander's attention toward Italy showed a remarkable intuition. He understood that the West, too, had the potential to rise as a rival. Conquering Italy would mean securing Europe for his dynasty and preventing any future opposition. Had Alexander lived to pursue these plans, the entire history of Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean might have changed dramatically. The idea of Macedonian-Carthaginian wars or Macedonian legions marching through the fields of Italy remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. But these ambitions remained only as drafts, notes, and strategic outlines because destiny would intervene before Alexander could set them in motion. As Alexander set about planning his next campaigns, he also began the monumental task of transforming Babylon into the shining capital of his empire. The city's fertile location along the Euphrates made it ideal for grand construction projects. He envisioned a metropolis that surpassed even the legendary cities of Egyptian pharaohs and Persian kings, a capital worthy of a world ruler. Alexander commissioned massive infrastructure projects, a giant harbor along the Euphrates to accommodate a naval fleet capable of reaching Arabia and beyond. An enormous palace complex, blending Greek and Persian architectural styles, symbolizing the unity of his empire. A royal road system, connecting Babylon to every major region he had conquered. A network of canals designed to improve irrigation and bolster trade throughout Mesopotamia. He even planned to rebuild the Tower of Babel, a ziggurat said to reach toward the heavens, which had been damaged centuries earlier. Alexander wanted Babylon to become not only the political heart of his empire, but also its spiritual and cultural center. His vision for the city reflected his deeper goal to fuse the East and West into a single civilization, harmonizing Greek philosophy with Persian governance, Egyptian spirituality, and Central Asian traditions. Babylon, in his mind, would be the birthplace of this new world. But as these projects began to take shape, cracks within his empire widened. Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, his recruitment of Eastern officials, and his integration of foreign soldiers into the army continued to sow tension among Macedonian elites. Officers who had marched with him from Greece felt increasingly alienated. They whispered behind his back, questioned his decisions, and feared he was abandoning the traditions of his homeland. The mass weddings at Susa, where Alexander forced several Macedonian generals to marry Persian noblewomen, remained controversial. His insistence on blending cultures was visionary, but it also created friction with those who wished to preserve Macedonian identity. These tensions simmered as Alexander returned to Babylon. Some officers resented the Persians' growing influence in court. Others felt the king was becoming unpredictable and emotionally distant. His grief over Hephaestion's recent death, his closest friend, and perhaps the one person he loved most, had plunged him into periods of despair and violent anger. The loss had shaken him to his core. Hephaestion had not only been Alexander's general advisor and confidant, he had been the person who balanced Alexander's ambition with compassion. Without him, the king seemed darker, more restless, more consumed by his need to achieve greatness before death caught him. Alexander threw himself into preparations for the Arabian campaign. He gathered fleets, ordered shipbuilders to produce hundreds of vessels, and studied coastlines and trade routes with obsessive detail. He recruited sailors from Phoenicia, Egypt, Cyprus, and the Persian Gulf. His engineers mapped port cities and planned bases along the Red Sea. These preparations consumed enormous resources and manpower. Even as Babylon transformed into a construction site of monumental scale, the army grumbled nervously. Many soldiers, already exhausted, saw the Arabian campaign as another long, grueling march without end. But Alexander would not be stopped. He was convinced he had barely begun the work the gods intended for him. As Babylon grew with scaffolding foundations and half-built towers, Alexander walked through the city daily, inspecting progress, speaking with architects, and drawing new plans. Workers rushed everywhere. Ships lined the Euphrates. The streets buzzed with activity from Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Babylonians, and traders across Asia. Babylon was transforming, but Alexander would never see it finished. His plans for the world Arabia Carthage. Rome the Atlantic remained on parchment. His capital remained a skeleton of what he envisioned. His navy, though massive, had not set sail. His empire, still fragile and diverse, was held together by his presence alone, and that presence would soon fade. In Babylon, while leading a final celebration for his officers and planning the next phase of conquest, Alexander fell ill. Whether from fever infection, exhaustion, or poisoning remains uncertain. But over the next several days, the unstoppable king of the world weakened. His voice faded, his breath slowed, his dreams slipped beyond reach. He never had the chance to see what Babylon could become. He never sailed toward Arabia. He never marched toward Carthage or Italy. His ambitions, brilliant, impossible, unfinished, remained suspended in the air when he died at age 32. In June of 323 BCE, inside the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, the greatest conqueror the ancient world had ever known lay helpless on his bed, unable to rise, unable to speak. Just days earlier, Alexander the Great had been at the height of his power, planning new campaigns, overseeing vast construction projects, and commanding an empire that stretched from Greece to India. Now, at just 32 years old, the king, who had never been defeated in battle, was dying. The cause of his sudden decline remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Alexander's descent began quietly. After a lavish banquet with his closest companions, he developed a fever. At first, no one was overly alarmed. Alexander had suffered wounds, illness, and exhaustion throughout his campaigns. But this fever did not break. It grew worse with each passing day. He lost his strength, struggled to move, and eventually lost the ability to speak. The palace became a place of confusion, fear, and speculation. Some believed Alexander had been poisoned, a theory fueled by political tensions, rivalries among generals, and the convenient timing of his illness. Others believed he had succumbed to malaria typhoid or an infection from one of his many war wounds. Another possibility is that years of unending exhaustion, emotional strain, and physical trauma had finally overwhelmed even his extraordinary constitution. Regardless of the cause, Alexander's decline was agonizingly slow. Soldiers loyal to him above all else demanded to see their king. As he lay dying, they passed before him one by one. Too weak to speak, Alexander could only raise his eyes or his hand in acknowledgement, giving them a final silent farewell. Many wept openly. These were men who had marched with him across deserts, bled beside him in battle, and believed he was touched by the divine. But even legends cannot escape mortality. After nearly 2 weeks of torment, Alexander died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, leaving behind a world that was not ready for his absence. His final recorded words, when asked to whom he left his empire, were chilling in their simplicity: to the strongest. With those words, Alexander's empire, built by vision genius and relentless ambition, was plunged into chaos. Alexander left behind no legitimate adult heir. His half-brother Aridaeus was mentally disabled and unfit to rule. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child Alexander IV had not yet been born. In the vacuum of leadership, the generals who had served Alexander began to maneuver. These were the diadochi, the successor's men, who had fought beside Alexander for years, each commanding their own elite units, each believing they deserved a share of his empire. At first, the generals attempted to preserve unity by declaring a joint kingship between Aridaeus and the unborn child. But this arrangement was fragile from the start. Ambition, distrust, and the sheer size of the empire made cooperation impossible. Soon, open conflict erupted. Over the next several decades, Alexander's former commanders carved the empire into pieces. Ptolemy Waswas seized Egypt, founding a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries, ending with Cleopatra VII. Seleucus, I took the vast eastern territories, forming the Seleucid Empire stretching from Syria to Persia. Antigonus and Demetrius, father and son, attempted to claim much of Asia Minor and the Levant. Lysimachus controlled Thrace and parts of Anatolia. Cassander seized Macedonia and Greece, eliminating Alexander's mother Olympias, and eventually ordering the murder of Alexander's son and Roxana. The unity Alexander had fought so hard to create dissolved into decades of war. His empire fractured into realms ruled by men who had once sworn loyalty to him. The dream of a single, unified world under a Macedonian king died with him. But Alexander's legacy did not end there. In fact, the greatest part of his influence was only beginning. Alexander's conquests created much more than an empire. They created a cultural revolution that reshaped the ancient world in lasting ways. This transformation, known as Hellenization, blended Greek language ideas, art, and philosophy with the diverse cultures of Egypt, Persia, Central Asia, and the Near East. It became one of the most influential cultural movements in history. Alexander established dozens of cities, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, that became centers of Greek language and culture. Greek, specifically Koine Greek, became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. It became the language of science, trade, literature, and government for centuries. Even the New Testament of the Bible would later be written in Greek, a testament to the enduring influence of the Hellenistic world. Under the Ptolemies in Egypt, the city of Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the world. The Library of Alexandria and its associated museum gathered scholars from every land. Mathematicians, astronomers, geographers, poets, physicians, philosophers, Hellenistic scholars achieved incredible breakthroughs. Euclid developed the foundations of geometry. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. Archimedes laid the groundwork for physics and engineering. Herophilus advanced the study of anatomy. None of this would have been possible without the cultural unity Alexander created. Greek art blended with Eastern styles, creating new forms of sculpture and architecture, monumental, expressive, and innovative. Philosophical schools flourished, including Stoicism and Epicureanism. Eastern religious ideas mixed with Greek thought, creating new spiritual traditions and mystery cults. Alexander's conquests opened Central Asia to the Greek world, creating early links between East and West. Greek influence reached as far as modern Afghanistan and India, where the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms emerged. Coins, art, and cities in these regions reveal a striking fusion of Greek and Asian styles. These cultural exchanges laid the groundwork for the later Silk Road, a network of trade and dialogue that connected civilizations for centuries. Though his empire fell apart politically, the world, Alexander, reshaped, continued to thrive intellectually and culturally for hundreds of years. The Hellenistic Age became one of the most vibrant periods in history, a direct result of one man's unprecedented journey across the ancient world. Alexander's death at 32 remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Was he poisoned? Struck by fever? Killed by exhaustion? Or, as some ancient writers believed, did he simply ascend to join the gods he so admired, no matter the cause his legacy endures? He changed the borders of continents. He connected worlds previously unknown to one another. He spread ideas that still shape modern philosophy, science, and art. He inspired centuries of leaders from Julius Caesar to Napoleon. He became a symbol of limitless ambition, brilliance, and tragedy. Alexander did not live long enough to see the full impact of his achievements, but the world he left behind, blended, changing, vibrant, became the foundation of Western and Eastern history. He conquered empires. He conquered cultures. He conquered time itself. More than 2,000 years later, the name Alexander the Great still echoes across history, an immortal reminder of what a single, extraordinary human being can accomplish. Imagine for a moment a single human life, brief, intense, brilliant, burning like a meteor across the sky. 32 years. That is all the time Alexander the Great had on this earth. 32 years to dream, to conquer, to build, to fail, to rise, to fall, and to leave behind a legacy that would reshape the ancient world forever. There have been countless kings, countless generals, countless rulers whose names faded into dust as the centuries passed. But Alexander's name did not fade. It grew, it expanded, it became a legend. His story is not simply the tale of battles won or lands conquered. It is the story of how one man's imagination, fierce, restless, almost divine in its intensity, became a catalyst for global transformation. Alexander's life was short, but his shadow stretches across thousands of years, touching everything from science to language, from art to philosophy, from the cities he founded to the cultures he fused. He did not just alter the map, he altered the course of civilization. Before Alexander, the ancient world was a collection of regions separated by geography, culture, and fear. Greece was fragmented. Persia, though mighty, was aging. Egypt lived in the twilight of its former glory. Central Asia was a distant mystery. India, for the Greeks, existed half in fact and half in myth. By the time Alexander died, all of these lands were connected, not peacefully and not without bloodshed, but undeniably connected. A Greek could travel from the shores of the Mediterranean to the foothills of the Himalayas and encounter cities, markets, and libraries speaking a familiar language. A Persian noble might serve alongside a Macedonian officer. An Egyptian scholar could study geometry in Alexandria under Greek teachers and read translated texts from across Asia. Cultures that had once seemed oceans apart now existed in conversation. This was the world Alexander created, a world in motion, a world in exchange, a world transformed. No conqueror before him had achieved such a thing. Few conquerors after him would attempt it. And no one, not even Caesar or Napoleon, would ever do it in so little time, with so much audacity, driven by such an insatiable spirit. It is easy to speak of Alexander as a warrior, a king, or a strategist. But what made him truly extraordinary was his vision. He was driven not by greed or cruelty, though he was capable of both, but by an overwhelming sense that the world as it existed was too small, too divided, too stagnant. He dreamed of unity. He dreamed of blending cultures. He dreamed of cities that would become beacons of learning and trade. He dreamed of pushing beyond the known, beyond the maps, beyond the limits that defined ordinary men. His youth was not a hindrance. It was the fuel. At 20, he became king. At 22, he crushed the Persian satraps at Granicus. At 25, he faced Darius at Issus and changed the balance of power forever. At 27, he marched into Egypt and founded Alexandria, a city that would later house the greatest library of the ancient world. At 28, he shattered the Persian Empire at Gaugamela. At 30, he chased Darius into the edges of Central Asia. At 32, he reached India, faced war elephants, and conquered kingdoms no Greek had ever heard of. Most men spend their lives imagining what they might accomplish. Alexander spent his life accomplishing what others could not even imagine. And that vision, born from a restless, fearless, almost reckless spirit, became his immortality. It lived on in the cities he built, the cultures he fused, and the stories told across generations. It is true that Alexander's empire did not survive him. Within a few years of his death, the Diadochi, his ambitious generals, carved his world into fragments. They fought, schemed, and betrayed one another, each seeking to inherit Alexander's mantle. No single king could unite the world the way he had. No successor possessed his genius, his charisma, or his divine sense of purpose. But even though the empire collapsed politically, his cultural legacy, what we now call Hellenism, lived on for centuries. Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Trade routes flourished across regions that had never interacted before. Cities bearing his name became hubs of science, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Artists blended Greek techniques with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian themes. The seeds of cultural fusion he planted shaped the world long after his empire fell. Without Alexander, there would be no Library of Alexandria. Without Alexander, Greek philosophy might never have reached the East. Without Alexander, Buddhism would not have acquired the Greek artistic influence seen in Gandharan sculptures. Without Alexander, Rome might never have encountered the Hellenistic world it later absorbed. Without Alexander, countless advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine might never have taken shape. In a very real way, Alexander's greatest conquest was not land, it was time. His influence stretched across centuries, touching civilizations that never saw his face. When we examine Alexander's life, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. His ambition was not human-sized. He dreamed like a god, marched like a force of nature, and lived with an intensity that burns even through the pages of ancient texts. He sought to unite the world, yet the world could barely contain him. He sought to bring cultures together, yet his own men could barely keep up with him. He sought to achieve the impossible, yet the impossible bent beneath his will. His story is both inspiring and tragic. A life lived at such speed cannot last long. A man who pushes the boundaries of the world will eventually reach the edge. Alexander's death ended his conquests, but it could not end his story. As long as history is written, as long as people wonder what one human being can achieve, Alexander will be there standing at the summit of possibility. As we conclude our journey, there is one truth that captures the essence of Alexander's life. When a person carries an ambition greater than the world itself, even death cannot end their story. Alexander lived only 32 years, but in that short time, he created a world that survived for centuries. He left behind ideas that shaped civilizations. He carved his name into the soul of history, and today, over 2,000 years later, we still speak of him. We still study him. We still struggle to understand the fire that drove him, a fire that refused to burn quietly. And now, we close this epic tale. I want to thank you sincerely for spending your time with this video today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of Alexander the Great, if you love long-form storytelling history, mythology, or ancient civilizations, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue creating massive cinematic historical documentaries like this one. Thank you for joining this journey across continents and centuries. I'll see you again in the next video where we step into another chapter of humanity's extraordinary past.